afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all of you to this very interesting sessions on greening G7 economies. As you know, climate has become a very important issue, and the climate change is getting manifested more rigorously, and we can see that on the frequency of floods, frequency of drought that we are facing, and also the rising temperatures, rising sea levels that we are seeing around. So it's very urgent that we have to act on tackling the problem of climate change, and we all have to work together. And I think that's why I think this topic is very, very important. And it's more important because G7 countries have the power, the leverage, resources to take a lead on this. And Professor Edward Barbe will take on these topics, and you'll explain how G7 economies can take the leading role in greening, and he'll talk about Climate Club. But before we start, I'd like to give a brief introductions about Professor Edward Barbe. Professor Edward Barbe is a distinguished professor at the Department of Economics, Colorado State University. He's also a senior scholar in the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. His expertise is on environment and natural resource economics, as well as international environmental policies. He has written numerous papers. He has over 300 research papers, several books, and book chapters. So we are very honored to have you, Professor Ed, here. Our discussions, we have three discussions. Dr. Anna Katharina is another discussion here with us. She is a very distinguished scholar. She is currently the director of German Institute of Development and Sustainability, and she's also professor for global sustainable development at University of Bonn. She was also chairing Think7 advisory process under G7 presidency of Germany. She has played a very important role in several global forums. She has led several initiatives. So we are very honored to have you, Dr. Katharina. Our next discussion is Dr. Amar Bhattacharya. Dr. Amar Bhattacharya is a senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development, housed at the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. His research area focuses on global economy, development finance, global governance, and link between climate and development. So previously he has held several positions under Group 24, G20, G7, and also he has also been associated with IMF and OECD and Commonwealth Secretariat. We are very honored to have you, Dr. Amar, here. Our next discussion is Akiko Takemoto. He is the program head, United Nations University for Advanced Studies for Sustainability. He has been leading several global initiatives. One of his flagship initiative was he was a environmental specialist, senior environmental specialist at Global Environmental Facilities, and also he also contributed to the formulations of Japan First National Adaptations Plan to Climate Change, and has served as a delegations to the IPCC and UNFCCC, and for promotions of Earth observations and environmental research programs. So thank you very much. We are honored to have you. So with this, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Ed.
Thank you, Dr. Hood. So I could have my slides. Thank you. So it's a great honor and privilege to be here to speak to you about greening the G7. And I want to thank Dr. Rahut and Dean Sonabi and the Asian Development Institute, Development Bank Institute, as well as the Think7 Japan Summit Secretariat for inviting me to talk. And what I'd like to talk about is how we can green the G7 through a more inclusive climate club. And there is a policy paper that I've written that I will refer to from time to time, and it has more details on some of the things I'll talk about here. But what I want to do is outline for you a crucial point that Dr. Rahut made, which is right now, climate action is at the crossroads. And the big question for the Hiroshima summit is, what should the G7 do? And I would argue that what it needs to do is to move on its proposal for a G7 climate club, but make it an inclusive climate club. And I believe that there's a strategy for doing this, and it involves 3 tiers or sets of policies. First of all, a series of domestic policy actions that G7 economies should take to remove some remaining market distortions in their economies that still favor fossil fuels and are slowing a low carbon transition. In addition, there are some actions that the G7 should take to establish its climate club to make it effective, but there are also actions it must do to make it more inclusive, and I want to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, to encourage other countries to join, and particularly emerging market development economies, and especially those in G20, in the G20 that are potential partners with the G7, there needs to be more assistance and certain types of assistance provided to these economies that want to join, and I will go through what those mean. And then hopefully I'll have some concluding remarks, and then we can get on to what I'm sure are going to be very interesting comments by this very distinguished panel, which I'm honored to share. So if you saw the recent IPCC assessment report, it made it very clear the world's got to make rapid and deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions if we're going to keep warming between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And that is also essential for achieving the net carbon emissions goal by 2050. And that means that particularly we have to make substantial cuts. Maybe half of our current emissions must be reduced by 2030. And we can't do that without transitioning from fossil fuels to low carbon energy. That's the challenge. And why do we need urgent action from the G7? Well, the G7's at the heart of this. It accounts for over half of global GDP, 28% of CO2 emissions, and 13% of world's population. And therefore, a low carbon transition by G7 economies would have a significant impact on this overall goal of keeping warming less than 2 degrees. And it would also benefit G7 economies by making them more sustainable, promote energy independence, and improve security. But the real, I think, challenge here is whether actions by the G7 can lead to global leadership. And we need global leadership in order to get those goals. And I liken the possibility here as a pebble in a pond effect. The G7 is essentially a very large pebble in all of this. And if it drops in and creates significant climate actions among themselves, and it creates the right incentives, that could ripple out and get other countries to join, and we would have substantial action. So the G7 must choose collectively climate action and a strategy that will permit and encourage other economies to join. And that's exactly why I think we need this type of 3-tier inclusive climate club strategy. Now, just to be clear where the G7's at, there has been some progress in recent years, and we must also recognize the building blocks of what I'm going to talk about, but there's also been struggles, which are also important to consider. So during the recent pandemic, the G7 spent about $1 trillion of green recovery on actions that did lead to some reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But the overall spending of the G7 was probably more around the range of $13 to $14 trillion. And some of that also caused emissions to go up. At the last summit in Germany, the G7 did propose forming a climate club, and it will be launched later this year formally. But if it is just exclusive to the G7, it won't achieve the global goals that we need. There has been some movement domestically within G7 economies, more carbon pricing in some, greenhouse gas regulations in others, clean energy subsidies, and so forth. But there still remains two fundamental market distortions within G7 economies that are stalling the low-carbon transition. And that's the underpricing of fossil fuels and the underinvestment in green innovation. And I want to take a few minutes to discuss both, because it's not always obvious what's going on. Let's start with underpricing of fossil fuels. So basically, there are two types of underpricing. One is something we're very familiar with, which is subsidies for consumption production of fossil fuels. But the International Monetary Fund also argues that we should consider part of the underpricing of fossil fuels the additional social costs that are not included in our use of fossil fuels. And that includes, of course, global warming, health effects from local pollution, congestion, road accidents from using fossil fuels more, and then revenue from undercharging for fossil fuels. And these additional social costs are quite large. So the overall underpricing in G7 economies is about $1.2 billion per year, which is about 20% of the total underpricing in the world. But $63 billion of this are production and consumption subsidies. The rest is these additional social costs. In addition, underpricing varies considerably across economies because we have different policies and different approaches to dealing with some of these additional social costs. So for example, the United States has the largest underpricing of over $650 billion per year. The United Kingdom is $24 billion. For the United States, most of that is the additional social costs. In Great Britain, a third of it is subsidies. So different policies, and it's not consistent. And one of the reasons for that is because carbon pricing varies considerably. And it's very clear that if the G7 is to achieve substantial reductions in emissions in the coming decades, it needs to do something about being more consistent and comprehensive in carbon pricing and increasing the coverage of emissions. And we could also think about regulations as being part of the solution as well. At the very least, we need to see a minimum of $75 per ton of carbon dioxide emissions in these economies. Some economies have achieved that. The EU, for example, with emission trading system is well above that target already, but the coverage of emissions is relatively low. There's a lot of exceptions for sectors, so only about 40% of emissions in the EU are covered. On the other hand, Japan has coverage across almost all sectors with very few exceptions, so 75% emissions are covered, but only $2 per ton is the carbon price. In the United States, there is no carbon pricing at the national level. However, the US does have subnational state-level pricing in some states, but not in others. We have regulations. We need to figure out how much are those regulations leading to actual incentives in terms of effective tons, prices per carbon. And then we need to make sure we're all on the same page in the G7. There's obviously policy concerns with pricing, fossil fuel pricing reforms. There's always been a concern that carbon pricing and other removals of fossil fuel subsidies would have adverse economy-wide effects. This is probably not true, except that the industrial competitiveness impact may matter with regard to emission-intensive and trade-exposed industries such as iron, steel, chemicals, and cement. And I'll come back to this in a minute. I think much more serious is the social acceptance and political consequences of initiating reforms. Dennis Snower in a panel earlier today mentioned this, that if climate policies are going to be implemented, they have to be socially acceptable. And we have seen the sudden and sharp rises in energy prices and rising costs for gas, heating, and electricity will actually impact the social acceptance. And so if we implement these reforms poorly and too quickly, we could have all sorts of major problems of their being socially acceptable. So what we indeed need to do is look at success stories, which I detail in my policy paper, that where these reforms have taken place and they've been successful, They've generally been done in a more transparent way. It's been clear what the revenues have been recycled for, and it's clear as well that stakeholders, key stakeholders and groups are consulted. So addressing the social acceptance of pricing reforms means that we should adopt two approaches. One is to say, okay, we want carbon pricing, but regulatory approaches also have effectively an implicit price. In fact, there's an OECD forum, the Inclusive Carbon Mitigation Forum, that's right now trying to figure out how do we translate, let's say, regulatory non-pricing policies in the United States into an effective carbon price, and how do we compare that to, let's say, the emission trading price in Europe. So we need to start understanding how these different policy approaches, some of which may be more acceptable in one country than the other, how does it translate to effective price, and does it get us to that $75 per ton of carbon dioxide goal? The other way we can be acceptable, as I already mentioned, is by recycling revenues to very important complementary low carbon policies and investments. Now, in my paper, I talk about three of them, but I'm going to only really here talk about one because time is limited. So the three types of policies we need to consider is public support for green research and development, investing in green infrastructure such as smart grids, charging stations, nature-based solutions, and so forth. And then also very, very important for social acceptance, offsetting any adverse income and employment effects. I want to talk about the first one because that gets at the second market distortion I talked about, which is the underinvestment in green innovation. Now, why we see chronic underinvestment in green innovation is that if I'm a private firm or research institute and I invest in research and development, I receive little of the returns to it because it spreads very quickly. It can be easily copied by my rivals in the industry or other research. So it spreads across the economy. That's good for the economy, but I don't get all the benefits from investing, even though I do the upfront costs. So in other words, what we know as in economics is that without public support, private firms and industries will chronically underinvest in research and development. And there's a cost to the economy because there's less economy-wide innovation overall. And this has been well recognized in economics. Danny Roderick pointed out that particularly for green innovations, which are risky and involve pioneer entrepreneurs and so forth, we tend to see this underinvestment occur much more. We see it in all types of innovations, but particularly in green investments. Unfortunately, just when we, the G7, and we, the world, need more green innovations, we're seeing that public support for that in the G7 is declining. So the share of environmentally related research and development in total public support for R&D has remained very low for 6 of the G7 economies, 1.5 to 3%, and surprisingly in the United States it's as low as 0.3%. And what that means is that the share of global green innovation and total innovation in G7 economies has declined, and in the 3 major innovators for green innovation in the G7, it has particularly declined: Japan, the United States, and Germany. And then also, it means that the G7 share of global green innovation has also declined. In the 90s, it was 90%. Now it's down to 2/3. Now, the G7 is still the major innovator in the world when it comes to green innovation. But what that means is that as green innovation has started to decline in the US, it's impacting how much innovation is occurring globally. So there's a global consequence for this market distortion of underinvestment in green innovation in the R&D, and it's becoming a serious problem. So that leads me to the first set of policies. The first set of policies is collectively G7 economies must decide on a set of fossil fuel pricing reforms that phase out fossil fuel consumption and production subsidies, phase in carbon pricing either explicitly or through regulations that give you an implicit price on carbon. And they must take the revenues from the phase out of subsidies and the phasing in of pricing and use that to invest in those three priorities I talk about, which is public support for green R&D, to offset income and employment and inequality effects, and also maybe invest in green infrastructure needs. Now, that's really important along the way with the second tier of policies, which is establishing a climate club and doing it in an inclusive manner. So to establish a climate club, as Bill Nordhaus pointed out, you need to have two mechanisms. That's essential to make it work and to actually affect emissions within the participating countries. First of all, those countries that are members have to agree on a minimum carbon price floor. They can go above that floor if they want to, but they have to agree on a minimum. And secondly, they have to impose penalties on all non-participating countries. What I argue in my paper is that to do this, we need to do two things. First of all, the tier one policies I talk about, and particularly those fossil fuel pricing reforms, should be the main precondition for joining the G7 Climate Club. Second, to make it more inclusive, we should follow what the International Monetary Fund has been recommending, which is to differentiate that minimum carbon price floor. So for example, let's say the target is what I suggested before for G7 economies of 75 tons per carbon dioxide emissions. Well, that should be the same target for any high-income country wanting to join the club, but it should be lower for a middle-income country. The IMF recommends $50 per ton, and even lower still for low-income countries, $25 per ton. Again, we should allow both carbon pricing directly, but also indirectly through regulations, subnational policies, and other commitments. And we should start with those sectors I mentioned before. The carbon pricing, minimum carbon price floor should start particularly for those emission-intensive trade-exposed sectors such as cement, iron, steel, and chemicals, because those are the ones that are going to be the most impacted through competition with non-participating countries. And to support that, you need the second mechanism that Bill Nordhaus was talking about. That mechanism should be a carbon import levy, which is the charge on a carbon embodied in the imports from non-participants. And that is what you need to protect industry competitiveness, particularly for the EITE industries, safeguard policies that you've adopted, and above all, prevent carbon leakage. Now, that in itself is necessary to start making the Carbon Club more inclusive. But if we really want to make it inclusive, particularly for emerging market developing economies and our partners in the G20 and other major economies, we need to provide assistance to EMDEs. And already, that's emerging market and developing economies. Already, we have two initiatives that could serve the basis for this. That's the Just Energy Transition Partnerships and the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, both which have been adopted and or launched by the G7. But these initiatives need to be scaled up, they need to be properly financed, and the finance has to be expanded, and they have to be broadened to allow more countries to involve. So already, for example, we've seen the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. One is with South Africa. Two have been agreed recently with Indonesia and Vietnam, and India and Mexico are negotiating. But the problem is that we need to make sure that these negotiations are done carefully, they're done with both sides and fully participated, and the financing has to be done at a bigger scale, and it has to have more preferential terms to encourage more countries, partners from joining. And they should be aimed at preparing these countries to participate in the G7 Climate Club. Equally, the Partnership for Green Infrastructure and Investment needs to prioritize green infrastructure, not just any infrastructure, but green infrastructure, and that are complementary to financing of this transition through the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. In addition, we have to assist our partner emerging market and developing economies in adopting carbon pricings and reforms to join the Climate Club. This is incredibly important. Already, the World Bank funded facility, Partnership for Marketing Implementation Facility is moving, has been moving in this direction, but we need to see the G7 provide additional financing, design, and implementation assistance in partnership with the PMIF. And then we also have to assist developing countries develop particular policies that may benefit them both in terms of climate, but also meet development and poverty alleviation goals. In my paper, I mentioned two of them: swapping out fossil fuel subsidies for providing more renewable energy services in rural areas, and using revenues from carbon pricing to fund nature-based solutions. Again, there's more details. I'm not going to go on there. In summary, I think the three-tier policy strategy is essential if we want to make a climate club central to global action and if we're going to make it inclusive. And it starts with those, the policy reforms that I mentioned, and actions and recycling of revenues, which are the tier 1 policies. Those policies should be the conditions to set up the climate club, but the climate club must also have differentiated prices and also encourage joining of emerging market and developing economy partners as well as high-income countries. And then finally, we need targeted specific assistance to emerging market and development economies. Finally, I'd just like to say that I don't think there's any other way we're going to see rapid, deep cuts in our missions globally unless the G7 takes action, and it must do so now. And I believe this type of strategy I've outlined for an inclusive climate club is one way, and I think an important way, to consider how do we get other countries to join. And the three-tier cycle, I think, is essential to making this approach inclusive and also for achieving those goals. Again, there's further details in my paper. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Professor Edward. It was very interesting presentations, very comprehensive, and I think you have clearly outlined the agenda that we could take forward and move on to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So thank you so much. And with this, I would like to invite Anna Katerina to give your views on Professor Barve's presentations, as well as, if you want to add anything, please feel free to add. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this important and interesting contribution, for this strong plea that the G7 has to act and has to act now, and has to actually act or offer a guide in many ways in transitioning our energy systems. I want to come sort of in with a few remarks and sort it along your tiers, your G7 policy strategies, and want to focus a little bit more or dig deeper on the question of how. If we take into account the situation that we have, some of the policy strategies that you recommend under Tier 1, we have sort of, you've shown, we have first steps in place, but they're not consistent, transregionally not consistent, etc. Similarly, on the Tier 2 level, we have the ongoing discussion on the Climate Club. If I recognize correctly, we also have here in the room Mr. Lankes from the Lankes and Stern report, so there is an ongoing discussion. It seems that makes it quite likely that there is actually a club being shaped or being formed. We will have to see. But you also underline the G7, that's the first step. You mentioned, well, G7 has to move forward and is not doing it properly at the moment, but the G7 is actually only for the first step, and then of course G20, and it has to be embedded in a wider context. Now, if we look at the current situation, we know that we have, for instance, the carbon tax in Europe, including the carbon border adjustment mechanism in place, but it was not developed in including basically quite a number of countries affected by CBAM, by the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It leads to substantial debate internally within the European Union, but also, of course, in our partnership structures, in our supply chains in the end. And it leads to quite some tensions on the WTO level. So we see here, okay, first steps, yes, but the difficulties lie in the not so small details, so to say. No? Similarly, we have, you've mentioned the JET-P instrument, excellent that it's there. Also very good that it has been signed by now with a number of countries and that it allows sort of adaptation of the instrument itself each time with regard to the local context or the energy sources in place in each country. The Kenyan JET-P will look in implementation very differently to the one implemented together in with South Africa, etc., etc. So that's very positive. But if I follow the discussions, and now I just refer to the internal discussions within the German context on trying to make this instrument actually work, so carrying it beyond the it has been signed level and actually taking it into implementation, it is very, very difficult. And reciprocity can be sort of questioned, whether indeed we manage to develop this instrument in a reciprocal manner, taking each other's interests equally into account. And that was the core idea of the instrument, to also use the instrument to actually develop reciprocal forms of reciprocal interaction. So here, just to sort of kickstart the discussion, how can we take these steps forward, basically? Maybe you can say a few more words on this, and I think there will be many aspects also here to be mentioned in the room. Then let me just, sorry, have to double check. On your third level, provide assistance, feed, for instance, now the profits or the revenue generated by a carbon tax or also by CBAM, feed it back into one of our systems of trans-regional distribution of wealth. I think that's clear that here the instruments have to be developed further in order to do exactly this, in order to feed it into funds that allow us to address the negative spillover effects, one could say, trans-regional spillover effects of CBAM. But also that has to be, of course, developed. I just want to raise here this one proposition by Secretary General of the United Nations, who says, well, we need an SDG accelerator fund, and he did not connect this to CBAM or carbon taxes. But nevertheless, that proposition stands and is a proposition towards the G20. So it might be worth reflecting on. Is that what could serve as a redistribution mechanism? At the same time, of course, if we then look at how at the reforms of the different systems that in a way facilitate trans-regional redistribution of wealth, whether it's the international financial institutions, it was mentioned before already, or the Beyond ODA discussions, etc., Bridgetown Initiative, then of course we know that we have here a whole landscape of institutional formats and also instruments that are being looked at critically, and have to all ask themselves whether they indeed allow reciprocal interaction and reciprocal agenda setting, or have to be adjusted in order to allow that more in the future. Maybe I just come to my last point. It's more a general point. What I find important to notice and recognize simply in the discussion around climate clubs and how they can be made more inclusive but still adhere to the measurements of a club and still actually bear a value. And this discussion, in my view, has been developing from the club that has been outlined to, and you've said it, to more inclusive approaches, to these thematically specific alliances. JETP is one example, but we also had now the food security alliances, a number of basically approaches where it's clear we cooperate on a certain topic, while maybe in other topics we disagree and do not take that forward necessarily. And this discussion has sort of been built up over a number of global governance platforms in the past years. No? It was partly G7, partly G20, partly the COPs, the climate conferences. And I find that very encouraging to see how we basically move, partly also the IPCC and IPBES reports even always, of course, contributed, but also served as additional third player platforms of facilitating the discussions then between science and policy making, of course. And that, of course, is to me very encouraging. It strengthens once more the reflection on what are we doing here, so to say. Why do we invest into the engagement groups that contribute to G7, G20 discussions and link it then to our contributions to the climate negotiations, to create a continuity and build the arguments, but also reflect on the nitty-gritty details that often stand in the way of actually making it happen. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anna Katarina, for your very valuable insight. I think you really pointed out, like some of the synergies that different groups has and how it's contributing towards this movement, and also the challenges that you pointed out from development to implementations. I think that's very, very important. And also the issue of reciprocity, which always comes in picture. I think that's something that I think Ed had missed, and thank you for pointing that out. And now with this, I'd like to invite Dr. Amar Bhattacharya to give your views.
Thank you, Dr. Raut. And since this is the first time I'm speaking here, I want to also begin by thanking Dean Snobe and ADBI and Japan for hosting us all here. So I think the first point is that I very much share the framework that Professor Babia has laid out. And it is one which I would say, puts greater degree of accountability on the G7. And I think that's a very important point. It recognizes that the G7, after all, is not going to be able to do this on its own. And it recognizes the importance of providing meaningful support for action in developing countries. Having said that, there's no point being a discussant unless you add some additional points. So I just want to make a few points. So I think the point on urgency could be stressed even more. It's not just that we are failing in trajectories, we are getting very close to tipping points. And I think with that comes really devastating change, especially for the developing world, and we should be highlighting that now much more as AR6 does. Second, policy leadership is crucial, as Dr. Babia points out. I would like to just underline a few areas which he mentions, but and one that he does not. So he basically correctly emphasizes two strategic points: the underpricing of fossil fuels, the underinvestment in R&D. I think sectoral policies and regulations could play a much bigger role. They do already in the United States. As you know, But I think that collective action on these policies could be very powerful. For example, agreement on phasing out, internal combustion engines by a certain point in time would have very, very important directional shift. Land use, another area which could have very big circular economy. So we shouldn't only put everything like we do as economists on pricing. Then, as you also point out, investment in public infrastructure, but also investment incentives like the IRA is trying to do in the US could be quite powerful. And certainly, as you again correctly note, just transition everywhere is going to be a very important issue. One aspect that you do not mention is the greening or the non-greening of financial systems. Okay, the discussion on finance has proceeded rather, in kind of sort of half steps. It began with a recognition that climate change would have impact on stability of financial systems. That's where the concern originally arose. But then it also became very clear that finance could be a very powerful enabler and incentivizer of change. And that is in an area where the G7 has been leading and not leading. And there's a lot of fragmentation within the G7 still on that, with issues about transparency, benchmarks, standards, disclosure, and very importantly also taxonomies. So we need, in some sense, much stronger G7 leadership and coherence around the greening of the financial system and also the risks of greenwashing. The McKenna report, I think, points out, and there's still a lot of active criticism. We heard that in a comment this morning that there's still more greenwashing than green finance. I then want to come to the notion of an inclusive climate club. I want to, of course, salute the work of my colleagues, Professor Stern and Hans-Peter Lankes, who's here, with which I was associated. I think that independent report on the Climate Club really is very resonant with what you say, Professor Babia. No disagreements, but a lot of detail there that may be helpful. I also want to salute the work of Jayant Sinha, who's a member of Parliament and chair of the Finance Committee in the Indian Parliament, who has led a very cooperative discussion around Climate Alliance with a particular perspective from the South. We had a very good discussion of that in the last T20 meeting in India, and much of that, again, there's a lot of accordance, particularly around the idea of ambition and support for developing countries. So I want to then focus a little bit on the support for developing countries, and this is based on work that I have undertaken with Nick Stern and Vera Songwe for the COP26-27, and what is the finance that is necessary to deliver on climate action in the developing world. And what we argue is that if we are to meet the ambition, we will need to quadruple the amount of financing for the developing world from something like about 600 billion in terms of green investments to about 2.4 trillion a year by 2030. In other words, what we argue is investment and innovation will be the drivers of green transformation in the South, and it will require significant effort both to unlock the investments but also to finance the investments. And we are very, very far apart. And we should not think of this only as a mitigation challenge. The green, the energy transformation, both on the supply and the demand side, is at the heart, indeed, of the 2.4 trillion. About 1.4 trillion, we argue, is for the green transformation. But we must not forget the enormous requirements for loss and damage, for adaptation and resilience, and for nature. And you have to remember that these are all areas where the developing world is impacted most and where the developing world's future is key to planetary future. By 2030, emerging markets and developing countries other than China will account for 50% of the emissions. So if we don't succeed in the green transformation in the developing world, we will fail on the global goals. So this magnitude of finance is extremely important. And in that context, you can look at the JETPs and see they're not even the tip of the iceberg. They are important, but they are not the tip of the iceberg. And I certainly think that the G7 should contribute, but I'm very closely associated with some of those JETPs. And at the moment, there is a big challenge about, in some sense, strong, predictable action and about strong, predictable finance. And the JETPs are at a very, very early stage on both. But we need to put the approach of JETPs, which some of us call country sector platforms, on steroids. And the way that we are proposing to do that is not so much only through the G7, but really through the structure of multilateral institutions. The IMF, the World Bank, the regional development banks, they can play a central role in these country platforms, indeed in a more legitimate way than the G7 can. My final point would be that there, as Anna Katerina has pointed out, there are a large number of initiatives underway right now. We had last week Bridgetown 2.0, which is seeking to give political momentum behind some of this agenda. We have an ongoing discussion in preparation for the Paris June summit. Very pleased that President Macron has asked India to co-lead that, and there's a lot of deliberation going on. I have a call this evening on related to that on some of the agenda items that we have to pursue. We have the SDG stimulus plan that you mentioned, coming from the Secretary General, which I think correctly emphasizes the synergy between the SDGs and climate. We have now a G20 Indian presidency initiative on MDB reform, led by Dr. N.K. Singh from India, and Larry Summers and Hans-Peter Lankes and I are involved in that exercise. I think there's a lot happening this year. And finally, of course, we have COP27 and particularly COP28, which is seeking to raise ambition around the issues of finance. So this is a very important year. And the best way that the G7 can contribute to that is through appropriate ambition. It has to show that it is, yes, it wants to push for a climate club, but it actually, in a measurable way, wants to foster, the kind of scale of finance that we are talking about. And finally, I would say that there are existing structures of collaboration that we should use, which are already functioning well. The Network for Greening of the Financial System, which brings together central banks from both developed and developing countries, I find as an extremely effective forum. I'm also closely associated with the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Action as an advisor with Nick Stern, and that has also become an extremely effective forum for cooperation around climate action. So we should, given the urgency and scale, yes, Climate Club, but let's use every means possible that we have at our hands to push climate collaboration and climate accountability.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amar Bhattacharya. Very interesting point. And also the issue of developing countries, I think it's very, very important. I think without handling the issues of climate change in developing countries, we are not going to make any progress in coming decades. With this, may I invite Dr. Akio Takemoto?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. So, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Barbier, for your very important, interesting presentation. Then I acknowledge your proposal to, or already established G7 Climate Club intends to promote the transforms the energy system from fossil fuel to clean energy systems through the instrument of carbon pricing. Then want to extend the network to the global south, G20 or other developing countries. So I hope that we will be successful, and particularly it's very important to demonstrate the leadership of the G20 leaders for promoting the climate action. So, but I'd like to touch upon the context on the collaboration between global north and global south. And also the synergy between climate action and the SDGs. Even if only G7 countries promote greening economy, but most raw materials of renewable systems come from developing countries. And also, Professor Barbier mentioned that to promote a nature-based solution, global food systems account for 23 to 42% of the global greenhouse gases, but majority of foods come from developing countries. So, regardless of that, calling for developing countries to join the climate club, I think automatically G7 leaders need to take into consideration role of developing countries for promoting green economies. So let me give us some figures. In terms of renewable energy capacity, in 2021 there are net increase of 260 gigawatt in the world, but by 2050 there are 100 times of this capacity is necessary, total 28,000 gigawatt. So this means that requires huge amount of raw materials, including critical minerals, and huge land space. So we cannot avoid impacting the environment and societies in the world. However, there is a lack of appropriate policy framework to promote these actions sustainably. Another example is batteries. Of course, for promoting renewable energy society, the huge amount of additional batteries capacity is required. And by 2030, 40 times of annual production is necessary for the current year's capacity. So that requires also huge amount of critical minerals. So demand for lithium for the use of batteries expands by a factor of 30 by 2030. So that will cause huge transform of the mining industry from fossil fuel mining to critical mineral mining. It is replaced according to the information by EA. So, but as I mentioned, there is not appropriate regulatory framework, and also not solid system for recycling. So this means that we need to consider that appropriate and a good policy framework and awareness raising, capacity building for the developing countries. So in this sense, the G7 must enhance the collaboration with G20 or other developing countries, and this kind of collaboration will give an incentive for other countries to join climate club if appropriate. And talking about the global food system, majority of the productions happened in developing countries, but transportation, consumption, and disposal of food is mainly occur in developed countries. So we need to, visualize the carbon footprint produced from such a global food system, and to establish the, better integrated framework to reduce carbon footprint throughout the global food systems. So, so in summary, there are lots of things to do. We have to do, not just for promoting carbon pricing, but we need various policy and measures necessary to promote the social acceptance, not only in developed but also in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Takemoto, for your very, very insightful, very critical thoughts, and also bringing out the issue of global North-South collaboration. Thank you very much. And also, some of the points that you mentioned are very, very critical and important to take into considerations. With this, I think I have two options. Maybe I'll give 4 minutes to Professor Babe, and then back to the floor.
I'll try and keep this brief because I'm really interested in what the audience has to say. First of all, thank you, all three of you, for excellent points, and it reflects your great policy wisdom and experience. Let me just say that the cynic in me has one response, and the optimist in me has another. And unfortunately, the cynic in me is winning out these days because time is running out, and all three discussants made that very clear. So the question then is, what can the G7 realistically do in a very short period of time to both transform collectively their economies, which is very important to all of this, and secondly, get other countries to follow suit? And the type of strategies I'm talking about as a framework, as quite rightly said, I think is one way in which this can be done, and it can be done relatively quickly. And it needs to start now. And I think that the Climate Club idea is an important part of this, but it's not the only part. It's necessary but not sufficient. In other work, I talk a lot about financing, and particularly with biodiversity and also climate, and also the role of the private sector and private financing. On the one hand, I agree totally that the investment and the financing has to come from the private sector, but from what I've seen, that unless we have policy guidelines and policy action, we won't see the financing come through. The truth of the matter is that almost 95%, no matter what sector you look at, biodiversity, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, protection of oceans and coasts, water, almost all the financing is public financing. Very little bit is private financing. The numbers are staggering in terms of the percentages. We just came out of a major shock to the world economy where we spent, like I said, up to about $14 trillion on just recovery. Only about $1 trillion was green. I don't think the world is going to be expanding public expenditures in a massive way in the near future. So what do we do? And I think that what we need to do is to put together policy actions that are affordable, that can be done reasonably quickly, and that can start with a small group of countries, very powerful in the world economy, taking the leadership. And that was what I was trying, that's the context as to the policies I was trying to put forward. Reciprocity is very much part of it, so I agree totally with you. In my policy paper, I make it clear that there are certain preconditions for joining the Carbon Club, which have to be agreed, first of all, by the establishment of the club, and secondly, the rules for other people joining, other countries joining, and I think that's incredibly important part of all of this. And I think that financing has to flow, but financing has to flow by scaling up what we have already in place and building it. And I agree with Amar about that, is that we got to make, we made a start on certain initiatives like the JETPs. We need to make them a more serious and financial and flexible and effort between both partners and the G7. And with that, I would like to hear what others has to say.
Yes.
Okay, I don't think I need a mic. My question is, when you spoke about a carbon border tax, and especially import levy, and that too in the context of non-participating countries, what is the impact on the developing countries, especially those that kind of stake their economic well-being on being able to export to the richer developed countries? So wouldn't that be too harsh a measure to take against developing countries at a time when they haven't quite been able to find the finance or the technology? And they won't, because according to your presentation, there isn't enough of it being done by way of investments or R&D in the developed countries and developed economies. So I thought it came across as a very harsh kind of clinical measure, but you might have done your assessments better, because it will only create greater disparities between the rich and the poor over time. And it's like literally closing your borders to imports or allowing them at very usurious rates to come in.
Thank you. Can we collect some more questions?
Thank you very much for your very informative presentation and discussions. As for the Climate Club, I checked the declaration of G7 ministerial meeting on climate, energy, and environment. There was only 3 lines reference, just advancing the open cooperative and inclusive climate club, and enabling conditions for substantial sectoral and industry decarbonization, and making decarbonized industry production the default business case over time. So there's very little reference. So I wonder, what is the current discussion within the, under the OECD or IEA Secretariat? What kind of actual discussion is going on in the final form of Climate Club you have just mentioned in connection with what you have mentioned? Thank you very much.
Can we have
Thank you very much. And thank you to the panel. I really thought this was a very, very rich discussion. I'd love to have the slides, Professor Barbier. 2 points. One is the urgency that everybody underlines. I would like to see that urgency also reflected in the speed with which this club comes together. It's been going extremely slowly. The task force hasn't even been formed yet and launched. This has been going on for too long, so it seems to suggest a certain lack of political will behind it. There needs to be urgency in that itself. Second point I wanted to make, just in reference, Professor Barbier, to the Nordhaus idea and to what Ambassador Joy has just also mentioned. I think the idea of a common CBAM, the Climate Club becoming a kind of common CBAM with an external penalty, a sanctions club which keeps others out, is unlikely to be realistic. It's unlikely to be realistic because even the G7 is very unlikely to be able to agree on such a scheme. It was difficult enough to do this in the European Union. But also, it's likely to end up being a very divisive instrument. In the current geopolitical environment, it is something that may backfire against the basic purpose of this exercise. And so I just wonder, how would we advise the G7 and other members of the Climate Club to go about having a set of positive incentives to join, having a positive and affirmative club rather than a negative sanctions-based club as a motivator for membership?
Thank you very much. I think there's so much of interest. I think you can see how urgent this issue is from the number of hands that we can see. But due to time, I would like to give back to Professor Barbe.
Thank you. They're excellent comments. So I think that if we want to have an effective climate club, I'm afraid we need to have some consideration of a penalty to protect the policies and to reduce negative consequences in terms of competitiveness of those industries within, of economies within the club. And we also need to consider the problem of carbon leakage, which is what could happen if you don't have those types of import levies. In my paper, I take the same rule that the view that the IMF does, or certain researchers at the IMF, that a differentiated minimum carbon floor is important, and also a differentiated levy. So it's not a complete ban, and it's not a complete restriction. So the pricing of the carbon levy would match, so it would be differentiated and equivalent to the rates I talked about with the minimum price floor. The second thing is important is that you want to start with the most effective, the modeling that I've seen on Climate Club shows that the most effective way to start is with emission-intensive and trade-exposed industries, which are the ones that I mentioned in my paper and also in the talk, which is the cement, iron, and steel, and possibly petrochemicals. And then broaden it out later on. I think that there are plenty of incentives that we could include to actually encourage adoption and joining by emerging market and development economies. The slides cover some of this stuff, but there's more in my Asian Development Institute working paper to discuss some of the policies in more detail and some of the studies to support them. So I would certainly refer you to that. It's easy to download from their working paper series. Thank you.
Thank you. We still have 2 minutes. I can take one more question.
So the panel might want to answer some of that.
Okay, maybe. Okay, please go ahead.
My question is Professor Barbe. Thank you for the idea of climate club. So we saw the 3-tier system and how it looks, what are the strategies to be implemented. So I was thinking about, you did not talked about the institutional and governance aspect of it. How will it look like, or how will it operate? So just your thoughts on that.
You mean the Climate Club?
Yeah, how will it operate? Who will govern? Who will look after it? How will it be monitored? Because we already have bodies like IPCC in place.
Right. Well, hopefully the G7 would do that. But I mean, I agree with the gentleman earlier. I mean, the big problem is that we're starting to see a slowing down of momentum of putting together a task force to do all of this. And also, I think what's really important is that we also have some degree of commonality that has to work out what's the pricing equivalent of non-pricing policies, like regulations, including things like restrictions on internal combustion engines and that sort of thing, and subnational policies, how's that contributing to emission reductions? So that's very important too.
Any panel member has burning response? Yeah.
I just want to say, I mean, on this, you know, is it a sanctions base? Is it a positive? I think, you know, you can have sanctions, but outside the club. The CBAM is, you know, probably the most viable one right now. You know, it's outside the club. And second, you know, there can also be sectoral sanctions, you know, particularly in the hard-to-abate, you know, trade-exposed sectors. So I really think that, you know, the focus should be on inclusion. And I didn't say this, but I think it's important. Inclusion means co-creation of the club, not a G7 club imposed on the others.
Thank you. Anna, would you like to say something?
Maybe just briefly towards Ambassador. I mean, the CBAM is the example, and it's exactly criticized for the aspect that it's the interests of importing countries importing basically into the European Union and heavily affected by it were not taken into account. And it's I would say very clear that that a mechanism needs to be developed in order to assure that the revenues collected are actually being then reinvested, whether it's through sort of existing channels of basically development cooperation with the affected countries, or whether it's through, for instance, the SDG stimulus suggested by Secretary General, or other means. I think that, of course, has to be discussed. But no, there is a lot of work on exactly this question: is it excluding, and with this also undermining credibilities, harming relationships further, and in a way also decreasing the likeliness of a climate club being actually installed, which I think we see at the moment.
Now I think we'll have to end. Firstly, I'd like to thank Professor Babe. Thank you very much for making your time for us and for your wonderful presentations. And I'd also like to thank our very esteemed panelists, Dr. Anna Katharina, Dr. Amar Bhattacharya, and Dr. Akio Takemoto-san. Thank you very much, and thanks to all the audience for your enthusiastic participations and for very valuable contribution from all of you. Thank you so much.